Virginia 5th Congressional District candidates Democrat Leslie Cockburn and Republican Denver Riggleman met at Piedmont Virginia Community College for their debate. The candidates talked about health care, climate change, women's reproductive rights, and the Mueller investigation.
CBS 19 News presents live coverage of the 5th Congressional District political debate with candidates Denver Riggleman and Leslie Cockburn at Piedmont Virginia Community College. Sponsored by Mickey Hamlet, attorneys at law.
And welcome to tonight's debate between the candidates running for Virginia's 5th Congressional District. I'm Tyler Hahn, your moderator for the event. We are here at the Dickinson Building inside Piedmont Virginia Community College, where the two will be debating. It will be live on television, which is the only time both candidates will do so. This will hopefully help you at home make an informed decision when you head to the ballot box in just a couple of weeks. And with that, let's bring in our candidates, Republican Denver Riggleman and Democrat Leslie Cockburn. All right, good evening to both of you. Now, the candidates will be facing a series of questions from a panel of local journalists and education leaders. That panel includes Frank Friedman, the president of PVCC, Courtney Stewart, a reporter from CBS 19 News. We also have Giles Morris, the executive director of Charlottesville Tomorrow, Elena Cantwell, a PVCC student, and finally, Siobhan McGurl, a reporter from our sister station, WDBJ-7 in Roanoke. And with that, we are also going to go over the ground rules of this debate. First, we ask the audience, like we said before, to hold all applause until the end of the debate. We also ask you to avoid any outbursts and distracting noises so that the candidates get full time to respond to the questions. And also, the candidates will have 1 minute each now to give their opening statement. We flipped a coin at the beginning before this to decide who that would be, and that is Mr. Riggleman.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Tyler. The reason this is such an honor is because community college is where I started my 10-year plan to get a bachelor's degree. And I'm very excited to be here because I went through about 3 or 4 community colleges trying to not only find my way, but also to escape the wrath of the professors who couldn't stand me. So it's been an incredible journey for me to go from community college all the way to a 4-year degree, all the way to master's at Villanova, all the way to the military, and then now here running for Congress. It is the American dream. And I believe that when you look at somebody who's never run for office, who's in politics for the first time, who's trying to do something that's right, at some point everybody has to get involved. I had a lobbyist tell me once when I was trying to get involved by myself that the only way that I could ever get anything done was to participate in the process, or he said I would just be collateral damage. As a former military person, I know what collateral damage means. So I appreciate this opportunity to come up here to share our views, and really I appreciate every opportunity I have to share everything that I can do to be a congressman in the 5th District. Thank you.
I'm Leslie Cockburn. I live in Rappahannock County, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight because part of my platform is that community college for students in the 5th District should be free. My career, as many of you know, has traversed a number of years, 35 years as an investigative journalist. I was at CBS 60 Minutes for many years. As a producer, I covered the world. I covered 6 wars, over 50 countries. And I was also a correspondent for PBS Frontline, wrote for magazines, books, gained skills that are critical now for this race for the 5th District. It couldn't be more important to translate those skills of bringing accountability to Washington. Thank you.
And with that, it's time for questions from our panel. These questions will apply to the both of you, and you'll be getting 90 seconds to answer a question. Now, whoever goes first and whoever responds, the person who went first will also get a 30-second rebuttal with these questions, just to make that clear. And we're going to start with Frank Friedman.
Thank you. Candidates, good evening. Welcome to Piedmont Virginia Community College. Most appropriately, your first question is about higher education. There is great concern about the cost of higher education. Is there a role for the federal government in making higher education more affordable? And if yes, what legislation would you support?
Denver, you go first.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I think there is a role for the federal government in higher education. I think it's to remove itself from much of higher education funding. I think there needs to be shared responsibility between the federal government and also colleges. When I went, I did get a Perkins loan, and actually to get through school. I was at UVA. I also had an ROTC scholarship. My goal right now, when you're looking at the $1.48 trillion in student debt, you have an average monthly payment for students, I think, between $201 and $351. So when you start looking at that, you're like, how do you do something where the government is not already underwriting all of these debt loads, and where universities and higher education and even trade schools sort of have unlimited access to raise those tuitions based on the fact that they're underwritten by the federal government? For me, I think we should all go through the Perkins loan. I think there should be shared responsibility, not only with the federal government, but also with the higher institution or higher learning. I also think we need to incentivize with some of those loans, if we go through Perkins, to make them available for trade schools. When you go around the district, you see that there are some jobs that are trade specific. They're not really specific to a liberal arts education. So I think at some point we got to make sure that trade schools are also part of the broad plan in order for us to make sure that we have the proper labor pools here in the 5th District.
I think there's a very important role for federal funding for education. Look at UVA, for example. I was with a UVA doctor the other night who was pointing out the very large amount of federal funding that goes into the medical school. All of UVA gets federal grants, and those grants not only are good for UVA, but they translate into this community, because there are so many businesses in Charlottesville that are born at UVA. For example, Apex Renewable Energy, where I was the other day, that started because of ideas and funding from UVA that was federal money. Also, community college deserves federal funding, and I say a lot more federal funding. For me, it's an absolute priority. And as far as student loans, I've made very clear in my platform that we have to make some dramatic changes. Right now, there's a bill in the House of Representatives that would make sure that students who have high interest rates for their loans could reduce those interest rates to match the lowest rate of any student getting a loan. Also, you need to be able to get rid of those loans with bankruptcy if it comes to that, as every other loan can be discharged with bankruptcy.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman, if you have a rebuttal?
No.
Okay, Courtney Stewart is next with her question for Ms. Cockburn.
Hello, candidates. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. My question is brief. Is healthcare a basic human right?
Ms. Cockburn, you.
For me, healthcare is a basic human right. I think that we have a completely dysfunctional healthcare system. Right now in the 5th District, we have had a crisis in Charlottesville because of the Trump administration removing subsidies from insurance companies and also getting rid of the individual mandate, which takes healthy people out of the pool. So you had a situation this summer where you could be a family of 4 on the individual market paying $36,000 a year with a $12,000 deductible. This is not sustainable. So we need to put the Affordable Care Act back into place. My opponent wants to ditch the Affordable Care Act. I have quite a different view. We desperately need it. We need it because all of the people in the 5th District, by and large, have pre-existing conditions. If we have to go back to the days before the ACA, when if you had a pre-existing condition, you could be denied health insurance. If you had diabetes, you could be denied health insurance. If you'd had cancer, you could be denied health insurance. This is not right. It is not right, and I'd say we need to go well beyond reestablishing the ACA, and I believe in Medicare for all.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman.
That's an interesting question. When you look at the Constitution specifically, and I'm going to answer the question in a couple different ways. Number one, I don't believe health care is a basic human right. Honestly, I believe that each state has responsibilities to make sure people have access to health care. But there was a Supreme Court decision, I think in 1935 or 1936, when you go back to that Supreme Court decision, that said that anything that wasn't specifically defined in the Constitution went back to the states based on the 10th Amendment. So when I look at these type of things and what the government is responsible for, I have another view on rights that was also part of the Constitution, and that is this. There is no right that you get where you can take something from somebody else to enforce that right. That being said, there are certain things about health care that are so very important to us, even as our family. Some of those are pre-existing conditions, and some of those are making sure that children are insured up to the age of 26. I also think there needs to be transparency, specifically when you do pricing for your medical companies. There are some bills that are going to come up in Congress that says that every single plan for every single provider, whether it's employee, right, or employer, you'll be able to see the prices of every single one of those plans on the internet before you make those decisions. It's things like that that we have to go to. I do think there needs to be a basic sort of minimum federal standard for health care. But I believe with health savings accounts, with transparency in pricing, but also in portability of health care, I think we can take care of a lot of that third pair of problems, fraud, waste, and abuse that we see in Medicare, Medicaid, and other social programs.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn for a rebuttal.
Well, Denver has pledged to join the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus is the organization in Congress that was responsible for gutting the provision in any new health care that's being proposed for pre-existing conditions. So are you for pre-existing conditions being covered, as the ACA does, the Affordable Care Act, or joining the Freedom Caucus?
Well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. Since I've never been in politics, I have the chance that nobody owns my vote. So when you do those type of things, if anybody thinks they hold my voting card or I can't make those type of decisions, that's a good thing about being an independent thinking guy, is I can be in the Freedom Caucus and I can vote the way that I want to. To me, I don't think you have to make those decisions and things of that nature.
Please
right?
avoid making any outbursts, ladies and gentlemen.
But that's okay. I mean, it's okay to laugh, because at this point right now, it'll just be based on my record and whether you want to vote for me or not. So if you don't think I'm going to do that, then don't vote for me.
Okay, Giles Morse with this question.
All right, you both did so well with a short question. Mr. Riggleman, do you believe in climate change?
Actually, when it looks at the science, I think we have to come to a point, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that there is climate change issues based on human activity. You have to look at it another way too, though. If it comes out of the United Nations, or we're looking at people who try to politicize this, or, you know, the amazing thing that somebody came up and told me that global warming was caused by cow farts, I think at some point you have to say that we have to have a practical way of looking at things. However, I also work in the research and development and technology sector, not only at the National Security Agency, but also for the Office of Secretary of Defense. When you have somebody from NASA, and we're looking at actually certain types of atmospherics that we have to deal with on the S&T side, and they're actually saying, hey, and these are guys that I actually trust, not the UN, not these people who politicize everything. When you look at NASA, I think there's a common sense way that we can address climate change, and also address making sure that any time we do address climate change, that we're not taking people's jobs away. It's okay to be bipartisan on this type of stuff. It's okay to believe in science. What I don't want to do is to have science become sort of a religion where we're taking jobs away from people rather than having some kind of incremental way of making sure that change happens. I was looking at some of the climate change stuff today, especially from NASA, and looking at the temperature variations. And I think at some point, and I would say that there has to be somebody who gets together where we have some kind of nonpartisan commission, not even but nonpartisan technical commission, to look at a long-term plan, right, to deregulate, to allow competition for green energies to actually go hand in hand with fossil fuels.
Ms. Cockburn.
Yes, I do believe in climate change. I believe it's one of the most critical issues of this campaign and of our time. I think that my opponent it's interesting. He's crossing boundaries here because the people he wants to join in Congress do not believe in climate change. And I don't think that he's going to be able to be a free actor in some of those votes. I think that the latest report that's coming out of the United Nations is very, very worrying for all of us. I think the fact that this country is the only country in the world that has not signed the Paris Accord is very, very worrying. And I think that the rest of the world is looking at this country and just wondering whether this country has gone crazy. I think that in the district, we have climate change issues. We have 2 frack gas pipelines coming through that will leak as much methane as the greenhouse gas equivalent of 46 coal-fired plants. Methane is 25 times more powerful than CO2. The Trump administration, supported by my opponent, has just loosened regulations on leaking methane, which will be a considerable problem for all of us in the future.
Rebuttal?
Yeah, it's a pretty quick one. It's hard to intellectually debate what you're going to be when you go somewhere and what your character is. But again, for anybody to think, and who knows me, that somehow you're going to convince me based on groupthink to do something one way or the other, we're going to have a bit of a scuffle in the congressional annex for my voting card. So that's my rebuttal.
Okay. Elena Cantwell from PVCC with her question.
Thank you both. I'm very honored to be here tonight. Candidates, with the current divisive partisan nature of politics that was highlighted by the Kavanaugh hearings, why should young people and young voters want to be a part of this system? Please convince us why we should participate.
You have to participate. You have to participate in the same way that I stood up now at this critical time to do something about what's going on in Washington. You have to participate because otherwise we can't do anything about climate change. If you don't participate, we can't do anything about student loans. We can't do anything about a living wage. We can't do anything about all the things that, that if you're young in America, you care about. We have social justice issues. We have criminal justice issues that if you want them addressed, you have to get involved.
All right, Mr. Riggleman.
You know, when I watched that process, the reason that I got involved in watching what happened with the Kavanaugh hearings was sort of based on the politicization of everything we were trying to do as a family and the things that we got involved with. I think what you saw there was you had an opportunity for that to be processed, taken care of well before it became public, based on when letters are submitted or based on the responsibility of senators and that process and the way it was set up. For me, when I look at this, the reason I am running is because of rule of law and process and constitutionality. It's for those very reasons, the fact that I don't think we can allow politicians to just be politicians and do things that are against the American good and the American welfare. That's why I'm here. It's the same thing that I ran into is why is every process politicized? Why can't we have an integrity in the process? You know, why can't we make sure that everything that we do goes to protecting those people that are put out into the public eye? We don't try to destroy families based on hyperbole or emotions or based on weaponizing the process to make sure that we get an outcome that we want. Polarization in politics can be lethal. And I think that's something that all of us have to look at. We cannot let politics become some kind of probability of kill for each person that walks onto a podium and tries to do something great. The one thing I can say about this campaign now is that when you have people running that haven't before, I do believe we've had a level of civility that we haven't seen in other campaigns at this point. And I think it's both based on people that want to serve based on what they've seen in politics, not because they want to be politicians.
Okay. Ms. Cockburn for rebuttal.
Yes, I think looking at what happened in the last week, we need more women in Congress. It will help a great deal. And I'm very excited to see all the women running in the country and 6 Democratic women up for Congress in the state of Virginia. It's an amazing thing, and it will really help with what we saw this week. Also, one other point about bipartisanship. I think I'm running out of time.
Yeah,
I'll tell you later.
Our time is up. All right, next is Siobhan McGurl from our sister station, WDBJ-7.
Good evening. You both expressed concerns with the pipeline projects running through our district. If those concerns hold true, what kind of federal legislation would you push for to address them? Are there steps you can take on the federal level to allow landowners more say in this process? Absolutely.
HR 1689, bipartisan bill that came out of Congress that what it tried to do is it tried to reduce the fact that any type of economic gain by a private corporation would have a higher threshold of proof in order to take private property. The reason I'm sort of involved with this was not only based on my daughter, you know, with the Won't Pipe Down documentary, but the fact is that the pipeline tried to come through my property, Atlantic Coast Pipeline. What we saw, at first we thought we were going to have a reasonable discussion about not allowing surveyors on our property, or a reasonable discussion about other activities or avenues that we could take. But what we found out is we were sort of powerless. And what I was referring to, even in the prior question, is that it seems like if you're not in the process, I had a lobbyist tell me this. He said, if you're not at the dinner table, you're on the menu. And I thought that's pretty interesting. When I am a citizen, you fight for your country, you build businesses and you sell them. You come back and think you can walk into a state house and you can change something. And you have somebody say, listen, buddy, you're not playing the game the way it's supposed to be played. So you need to participate in this process either by pay to play, right? Or you're going to have to get involved with politics at some point because you're not going to get anything done. Private property rights are the backbone of what makes us a great country and a great nation. I am a critical infrastructure expert. It's what I do in the Department of Defense now. I attack them. That is what I do. I think we can have it both ways. I think we can protect private property rights and grow an independent critical infrastructure.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn.
Well, I think it goes well beyond private property rights. If you're concerned about private property rights, then you would also be concerned about the property of ranchers on the border of Mexico and not putting a giant wall on their property. I think that for me, the pipelines can be addressed at a federal level in different ways. One, FERC went ahead with these pipelines. It's a government agency, and it went ahead very quickly without responding to all of the demands of the Department of Interior, for example. That should be, we should be holding their feet to the fire on that, and I would certainly do that as a congressperson. Also, safety issues. The pipe, when it's actually in the countryside, going next to a farmhouse, is thinner than it is in an urban area. And the idea is, well, except for the people who live right next door. So you can't have differences in the thickness of a pipe because you are really jeopardizing the family who lives right next to it. And we have whole communities who are in the way of those pipelines. We have an African-American freedmen community and historic community in Buckingham County called Union Hill. And what is planned at the moment is there will be a giant compressor station for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline right in the middle of that community. That will spew toxic chemicals.
Your time is up.
Okay.
All right, any rebuttal from Mr. Riggleman?
Sure. You're right. There's going to be certain areas, I think, with eminent domain where we're not going to have any type of wall or physical security. And that's why I thank God I'm an expert on passive detection measures, not only using remotely piloted vehicles, but also other types of technical activities like what we can do to look at the border. That's something that I actually did down in border ops probably about 10 years ago. So there are other ways to stem illegal immigration flow besides physical security. I just happen to have some of those methodologies, and I would fight for those who don't want to wall across their property, but there are other ways to do physical security and also electronic security on the border.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn, any rebuttal?
Well, I think I'll continue with that story of Union Hill. Union Hill is, as I say, an historic community. It should not have a giant compressor station that sounds like 4 diesel locomotives running 24/7 in the middle of that community. That is an issue. The NAACP has weighed in very heavily on that issue. It's an issue of environmental justice. And if you care about climate change, the pipelines are a climate change issue as well.
All right, then we'll circle back to Frank Freeman to keep going.
Let's talk about poverty. The federal government spends a great deal of money helping people survive poverty. For example, food stamps, Medicaid, public housing, etc. But it spends comparatively very little to help people get out of poverty. What should the federal government do, if anything, to help people get out of poverty?
Ms. Cockburn.
Well, first of all, what the federal government is doing at the moment is making sure that more people stay in poverty because they want to take food stamps, SNAP, away from 1 million families. That is a disaster in the 5th District of Virginia, where we have counties like Campbell County, where over 50% of the children in Campbell must have a free meal at school or they're not getting enough to eat. So the idea of withdrawing our safety net, we're being told now that we don't have poverty anymore in America. We have 40 million people who depend on SNAP to get by. So we need to address what's being taken away from people right now. Also, if you say that people have to work while they're on Medicaid, most people who are on Medicaid are already working. And over 80% of the households on Medicaid have children and older people, disabled people at home. So right now, people are suffering. And to say, well, we're going to help you get out of this, the federal government said, well, you have to work, but we're not actually going to pay for transportation or training or childcare. Well, there's no way you can work if you don't have any of those things, and the state can't afford it. So we need to rethink this, and we need to make sure people have the benefits they need, and then we proceed from there.
All right, Mr. Riggleman.
I think a minimum social safety net is needed, and I can tell you a story. I was on food stamps a few times. Most recently, I think 1993, when as an enlisted troop, I made a total of $11,000 for a year with a wife and 2 kids. When we were on food stamps, I also worked as a professional mover for McCollisters out of New Jersey, and also went to school full-time. After about 6 months, we tore up our food stamps because at that point I was making enough money and we weren't going to use them anymore. We have to have a minimum social safety net for people like me and others to get a leg up. There's something pretty exciting in the tax reform bill that we saw, and it's called opportunity zones. It's bipartisan. So government 12 opportunity zones in the state of Virginia and the Commonwealth. Why? Because the Tax Reform Act allowed him to. Now, they're called opportunity zones where you get investment in those opportunities. 20% of the opportunity zones were in the 5th District. So out of the 212, you're talking about 20% of the opportunity zones are here. It allows you to do 2 things. If you invest in those opportunity zones, which I would like to do at some point, if you invest in those, you get a deferment on your capital gains tax and a bunch of tax advantages. If you invest in it outside of the opportunity zone into people in these rural areas, you also get those same tax advantages. When you look at bipartisan stuff like that, right, when you have a Republican Congress voting on a tax reform act with a Democratic governor who gets to pick the opportunity zones and actually based in the press, I think that's what you're seeing is you're starting to see some action on making sure that everybody has opportunity that we were allowed to have based on the safety.
Mr. Riggleman, your time is up. Mrs. Cockburn for rebuttal.
Well, I think that's a very nice idea, but I think we have some really dire problems in the 5th that need to be addressed, not with opportunity zones. We need to make sure that we don't take health care away from people. You know, you can put $1 in someone's pocket. This is very Republican. Let's put $1 in your pocket and take $3 out of your other pocket. So if let's talk about that Tax Reform Act. That put $1.9 trillion onto the deficit of the United States.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn, your time is up. Mr. Riggleman.
Sure, let's talk about deficits and numbers. So if you want to look at the CBO, over the 8 years of Obama's administration and now projected over the Trump administration's 8 years, this is going to probably wow some people. The deficit projections are exactly the same. Tax cuts do not create deficits, spending does. So if you have individuals that are paying more in taxes because there's more jobs, then you're looking at spending as a 7-to-1 ratio that we have to get rid of. Thank you.
All right, last question for this round will be from Courtney Stewart, and that will go to you, Mr. Riggleman.
Oh, good. Okay. My question is, what action or actions has your own party taken in the last several years that you disagree with?
Oh, my goodness, that's a lot. I'm not a big fan of the debt ceiling. I'm not a big fan of scrubbing the NDAA for certain types of funding based on waste. But for me, if we keep increasing the debt ceiling and keep sort of putting people in indentured servitude through the spending habits that we have, it's something that really bothers me. You know, when you run a business, when you run a company, not only do you sign both sides of the checkbook, but you sort of got to balance your ledger, right? And what is it? What are we now? 21 trillion, headed to 22 trillion, right, in debt. We're running deficits anywhere between 800 billion and 1.1 trillion. If we look at the average debt load, Obama was 7.3 trillion. Trump is looking like 7.28 to 7.3 trillion. This has to stop. We can sit up here and argue about, you know, tax cuts, spending, and things of that nature. But right now, if we don't look at an audit of the government agencies and who's doing what, we're going to have a real problem with spending coming up. We also have some other issues. We have 70% of our load is actually Medicare, Medicaid, and social programs. 15 to 17% of that GDP load is Department of Defense spending. Now, if you start to break it down, 2 to 3% might be DOE, might be DOT, but at some point we got to start stripping the funding, look at the professionals that are going to run it, because we want to have a government, we don't want to get rid of it. We want to look at the professionals that are running the government and make sure that we have an efficient way of doing business, but not a way where bureaucrats are not only running anything, but taking the full load of those monies that we have in our budget.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn?
I think I'd like to go back to that $1.9 trillion that has been added by the Trump administration to the deficit. It matters. The deficit is going up dramatically. The interest is going up dramatically. It's not true that it's staying the same. In fact, it's shocking, the numbers. So we need to reverse that. If you give a huge giveaway to corporations and to the wealthy, and well over 80% of this giveaway was to corporations and the wealthy, you are going to put a bill to our grandchildren that is absolutely enormous. We need to reverse this. The Republicans love spending money, and they have just spent it on their friends, and it is wrong. So to say that the Obama administration and Trump administration are exactly the same on this score, I think is ridiculous.
Okay. Mr. Riggleman for a rebuttal.
Sure. The biggest year deficit for President Obama was 1.62, 1.65 trillion. This year, Trump, it'll be about 900 billion. Thanks.
Okay. Anything from you, Ms. Cockburn?
Well, the shocking figure is interest has gone up to 538 billion for fiscal 2018. So it's certainly getting a lot of attention in the financial press.
Okay, well, that wraps up the first round of questions. Now we're going to switch things up, and this will move on to just one-word responses. So everybody take a breath. I promise they're easy for the most part. We're going to start out with you, Ms. Cockburn, since he went last. What is the best quality of a congressman or congresswoman? And one word.
Endurance.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman?
Tenacity.
Okay.
That's the biggest word I know, by the way.
And one more.
Thank you.
Favorite vacation spot, Mr. Riggleman?
Scotland.
Okay.
Ireland.
All right.
Hey, it's too close, Leslie. My goodness.
All right. Which politician do you most admire?
None of them. Oh, it's 3 words. Thomas Nelson.
Okay, Ms. Cockburn.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Okay. Let's make this our last question. And we had this pitched to me a little while ago. What is your favorite 5th District high school sports team?
Who's first? She's going to say Rappahannock County. I'm going to say Nelson County. I got a feeling that's probably going to be the answer.
Let's start with Leslie.
The Mountaineers.
Okay.
Yeah, Nelson.
All right, that was too easy. All right. Now we're going to go back to the panel. This time, panel members were asked questions directed at one of the candidates specifically. Now, if that candidate mentions their opponent in the answer, the opponent will then get 30 seconds to respond. Next up on the panel, I believe we left off with Courtney, so we'll move on to Giles from Charlottesville tomorrow.
Great. Who am I asking?
Denver, did you answer the last question first?
My memory, I got.
Memory.
I think I did the first question last time. Okay. I think is that correct, Leslie?
Yeah. Okay. So Ms. Cockburn, we'll go with you first in this one.
All right, Ms. Cockburn. The events of August 2017 in Charlottesville have become a lens on national conversations about racial justice and equity. Also, Prince Edward County and Charlottesville were both centers of the massive resistance movement that resisted school integration. Do you think America has a racial equity problem, and does the 5th?
Yes, I do think it has a racial equity problem. I just spent 2 days with a great civil rights leader who is Congressman Jim Clyburn, and who, in fact, one of the facts I love about him was that he met his wife in jail while they were both involved in the civil rights struggle. Yes, we do. And one thing that Congressman Clyburn and I would love to do is the Moton School in Farmville, which is now a small museum, which was the epicenter of the desegregation movement in America in 1951, when the students of Moton walked out of that cafeteria room. We want to expand it and create a bigger civil rights trail coming through the 5th District and highlight the importance of Farmville. I have a friend who was the youngest person to walk out of Moton School in 1951. She is called Joy Speaks, and Joy remembers having class in tar paper shacks where the rain poured through and the students actually had to hold umbrellas at their seats in order to write their papers. We need to address problems that she sees opening again, as she calls it, I see it again, and I think a Pandora's box has been opened that we need to address.
Okay. Elena, you want to ask your next question for Mr. Riggleman?
Mr. Riggleman, is the press the enemy of the people?
No. So I think there's something that you have to look at, and you know, I've gotten used to the press over the last few months. What's pretty exciting about the press is I do think they lean a little left. But I've been very fortunate in that I really sort of like being transparent with the press and actually sort of having a dialogue with them. Whether you're talking to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Rolling Stone, you start to figure out that these are just people trying to do their job. And for me at the beginning, I was a little bit nervous. You know, you hear the stories, you see things of this nature. I had a couple things that happen on left-leaning blogs that were just out of control. But what happened was when you start to explain your situation, it starts to come back and you start to have people that start to listen and give you fair stories. So I really don't think the press is the enemy of the people. I think what the press is one of those balancing functions that we have to have in a free society. What I would ask, though, if you have a free press, is that there has to be some impartiality based on how you treat each person and where they come from, their background, what their political leanings are, and how they're looking at things. I think it's very easy to get caught up in a vacuum. You know, when I was young, I didn't think there was any racist problem. I played ball in Manassas, Virginia. I didn't know. But once you get out in the world and once you see these type of things, and I'm going back to racism a little bit, you start to see that these things are happening. And, you know, that's some of the things that I've seen, not only with the press and what I've been able to express, but also with racism. Oh, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Moving on to Shabama Girl from WDBJ7 for Ms. Cockburn.
Ms. Cockburn, you said women's reproductive rights are under threat from the Trump administration. What specific steps will you take to ensure that women's reproductive rights are upheld?
Well, I think that my opponent has declared that Denver has said that he wants to get rid of Planned Parenthood funding, that that's one of the first things he will do, should he go to Congress, is to do that. That takes away cancer screenings, it takes away contraception for 2.4 million women in this country, many of them women of color and rural women, like all the rural women in the 5th District. So we need to protect that. We need to protect Planned Parenthood. We need to protect women's reproductive rights. We now have, because of events in the past week, we now have a Supreme Court who would probably like to overturn Roe v. Wade. This would be a disaster, and I would remind everybody that Roe v. Wade protects a woman's right to privacy. It's a constitutional issue. So I think that you know, we have a lot of women's issues that we have to look at on the Hill. We have domestic violence issues. We have sexual violence in the military. There are all kinds of bills on the table where we need more women to come into Congress to address these issues. I think that, you know, we are not helped by the Freedom Caucus and others like it, other groups like it, who do not care about women's reproductive health.
All right, and moving on to Frank Friedman, this question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
I have a foreign policy question. Is it in the best interest of the United States to have troops in Afghanistan? If yes, what should be our objective? If no, would you support legislation supporting a troop withdrawal?
Yeah, it depends on the mission at that specific time. So You know, I mission planned the first bombing runs to Afghanistan after 9/11. I was with the 34th Expeditionary Bomb Squadron. Right now, when you look at in Afghanistan this year, we've had 7 people killed. We've had over 25,000 injured in the last few years. The reason I know this is because I get the reports every morning. I think at some point when you look at Afghanistan, we have succeeded in some mission areas, though we do see the Taliban starting to come back a little bit. Right now, if I had my druthers, I think we need to put a mission statement out there and start to withdraw within the next couple of years. A lot of it has to do with my brothers and sisters. We just celebrated the 17th anniversary on October 7th of the bombing runs in Afghanistan. I started mission planning those bombing runs on October 2nd. So as a DOD guy, as somebody who's been in harm's way and somebody who's seen others in harm's way, I think there comes a time that we have to get out. And if it's legislation that looks like we can at least sort of put a stable government structure in place in Afghanistan, I would be willing to look at a withdrawal, specifically legislation withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. My guess is this, though. We're never going to have 100% withdrawal. We're going to always have observers. We're going to always have issues in that part of the area with the Taliban and with terrorism, especially with some of the state-funded actors that we have out there from Iran and other countries. So it is something I would look at for sure based on our mission statement and based on where we're at right now.
Before we move on, I want to apologize to you, Mr. Riggleman, because Ms. Cockburn mentioned you defending Planned Parenthood in her question, and I did not give you 30 seconds to rebut her answer. I didn't know if we wanted to take the time to let you do that, if you had anything you wanted to add to that. No? Okay, just wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure I'm fair to both of you, so I apologize for that. Moving on to Courtney Stewart. This question will be for Ms. Cockburn.
Okay, so what are the greatest economic opportunities in the 5th District, and how would you help capitalize on them from Congress?
I've got zeros up there. There we go. Okay, good. First of all, I'd like to address the issue of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, I covered 3 different wars in Afghanistan. I covered the Mujahideen War, I was in Kabul when the Taliban came in, and I was there during the American War. I will say, talking about the planned bombing raids right at the beginning of the war, Denver was not in Afghanistan. He was in Diego Garcia, which is 3,000 miles away from Afghanistan. And I think the person who believed he was planning those raids was General David Deptula, who was not in Diego Garcia. Also, we know from Michael O'Hanlon that those planned raids were very unsuccessful, that the bombing didn't become successful until you had special forces on the ground calling in airstrikes. As for what should be done in Afghanistan right now, we've been there 17 years. My friend John Sopko, who is the Inspector General, tells us that we have spent nearly $1 trillion on that war, and we are definitely not winning it. One problem is that the patron of the Taliban is Pakistan. We have to negotiate with the Taliban and Pakistan in order to leave that war. And I think that this should be a matter of diplomacy, and it needs to happen now.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman, you get a rebuttal since she referenced you in that
yeah,
question.
we worked with the Joint Forward Air Controllers in Afghanistan, worked on trigger ops, so it's hard to answer this in a way that doesn't sound emotional. But working with the JFACs, working with Stopping Fratricide and Friendly Fire, I'm not going to defend my military service because of what I've done, which has been pretty neat. But those JFAC strikes on the caves, yeah, that was us. So, but I do appreciate the try.
All right, moving on to Giles Morris. This question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
All right. So you're going to answer this question, right? The one I asked, or do you want to talk about race? Because you didn't get a chance last time.
Whatever question you want to ask.
I'm just joking. So we didn't stay on question the last one. You talked about the scarcity of labor, particularly farm labor in the 5th District. You've also talked about your views on immigration policy on enforcement. Do you ever talk to immigrant laborers about how they would solve the labor problem in the agricultural areas of the 5th District?
So I was on a farm here in Nelson and got to talk to some of them there. And for them, they just want to keep working. I talked to one, he'd been there for 30 years. There was about 105 H-2A workers on that specific farm. Talked to another one, another farm down south, I think in Mecklenburg. I think they had about 40 or 50 H-2As. And the question I asked him was this. I said, what is the percentage of labor on your farms for immigrant labor. And one of the guys said, guess. I said, 60%. He goes, I said, 70%. He's like, I said, 90%. He goes, 100%. So it was the same at Saunders Farm. And what they asked me, even when you're at a dairy roundtable, when you're at a tobacco roundtable, when you're any of these, is like, hey, Denver, this is going to be an issue. We believe in border security. Great. We're Republicans, that's what we believe in, rule of law. However, we need some help with immigration law because of the regulatory issues that we face. Not only that, we need to streamline immigration because of the labor shortages that we have. When I talked to one of the farmers, this is what he said. He goes, right now, if any of these regulatory issues start to bite me now, or if there is any more expense added to this, or any more issues from the Department of Labor, if there's any more issues, I have to shut down. So what I started to see on all this is we have to have some way to streamline immigration, specifically labor, inside the 5th District. And I'm not going to speak for everybody else, but the 5th District, I have to make sure that we streamline immigration from H-2A to H-2C, or have some way to get that regulatory burden off of them.
Okay, Elena Cantwell from PVCC. This question will be for Ms. Cockburn.
Ms. Cockburn, as you previously stated, there are 6 women running for congressional office in Virginia. What unique perspectives will women bring to the political office?
Well, each one of the women is very different. They have a very different background. But what's interesting about them, many of them have not been politicians. So you have someone who was in the CIA, Abby Spanberger. You have Elaine Luria, who was a commander in the Navy. You have Jennifer Lewis, who was a mental health worker. So people who are extremely competent in their fields. But I do think that women bring a different perspective to the table. I think you always see that. And I think that we can look forward to that. I would like to mention something about immigration, though. I would like to say that we need comprehensive immigration reform. We need it in the 5th District, and we need it in this country. We had a bill, a Senate bill, that was bipartisan, that was put forward by John McCain and Chuck Schumer. But John McCain lived in Arizona. He understood the border very well. And this comprehensive bill passed the Senate. It would have folded in the DREAM Act and all of the things we care about. And what happened? It went to the House of Representatives and it was killed. And do you know who killed it? The Freedom Caucus, the same group that my opponent has vowed to join.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman, you want to respond to that?
I love the word freedom.
All right.
That's it.
All right, moving on down to Shaban. This question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
Well then, jumping off that, you have expressed interest in joining the Freedom Caucus. It's a committee formed with the aim of pushing House GOP leadership rightward on fiscal and social issues. I want to know, how do you see that kind of approach affecting people specifically living in the more impoverished areas of the 5th District?
Well, for me, on the Freedom Caucus, the reason I was attracted to it was based on the fiscal ideas of taxation, right? And based on what I saw with what was going on with the debt ceiling, with the deficit and the debt. As far as the social issue side, I'm a little bit different. But as far as what we're looking like in the 5th District, I think what we're seeing with tax cuts, even when you're seeing down in Danville, they cut taxes down to, 25 cents to actually attract data centers. You're seeing that people are starting to see that tax cuts actually do help, that attraction of business and what's happening right now. So when you look at Danville, when you look at opportunity zones, when you look at 4.2% GDP, when you look at the lowest rate of jobless claims in 49 years, when you look at 6 consecutive quarters of growth, right, as you go forward, when you look at this as sort of a macro level, it's starting to work. I honestly believe it's going to be about 2 to 3 years before you even see the advantages of the tax cut and the job reform bill. I think it's going to get better. And I think that's because if we can get some people with fiscal responsibility in there and start looking at the spending side and not just the tax cut side, I think we can do some really great things.
Okay, moving back to Frank Friedman, this question will be for Ms. Cockburn.
Okay. It appears that many politicians are satisfied with a very divided nation, as long as they get enough votes to be elected. Do you want to unite the people of the 5th District in the nation? And if so, what will you do to increase unity?
Well, in the same sense that, look at what happened at a state level. We had Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion helped 400,000 people, and that's Democrats and Republicans. So there are lots of bipartisan issues on the Hill that will help everyone in the 5th. The first bipartisan issue that is important to me is H.R. 800. It's a bill that turns rural broadband into a very important issue in government. It creates a whole office in the Department of Agriculture. It puts an undersecretary there so that it becomes like rural electrification. So that is completely bipartisan. And I would absolutely support that. And I would also support, don't forget, when I was talking about comprehensive immigration reform, that was passed the Senate. That was the Gang of 8. That was 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats who brought that together. So you can do that again with comprehensive immigration reform. There are a number of issues that we can work on that seem small but can change people's lives that are bipartisan.
Okay, moving on. Courtney Stewart, this question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
All right. Has the Mueller investigation been handled fairly?
Mueller? I think so. I mean, you haven't heard much the last 2 or 3 weeks. I think when you're talking about the FBI, nobody, he hasn't been fired yet. But I think we need to bring this into fruition, make sure we look at Russia. And the reason that I would is just based on what I do with Russia every day. So when you're looking at intrusions, when you're looking at stuff, I think this has been released in the press, but definitely Russia has an ability to get to us at the cyber level and the infrastructure level. So I think when you're looking at meddling in elections, Russia's been doing it since the Communist International, I think of 1919 or 1918. This is something that they do. I think we need to investigate if anybody's actually been obstructed with or identified as somebody who did this. I think you're seeing some of that. But as far as collusions happening in the Trump administration, I just don't think that's happened.
Okay, Giles, this question would be for Ms. Cockburn.
All right. Ms. Cockburn, the 5th District is largely rural. Democrats have had a hard time winning it. They've had a hard time winning congressional seats in rural districts. Do you think there's a credibility gap for Democrats outside of urban areas?
No, I don't. I live in a rural county, the most rural county. There are only 7,000 people in my county. So the problems I see in Rappahannock are the same as I see in Halifax or in Appomattox or any other rural county. I don't. I think that, look what's happened with our campaign. We're now neck and neck, which it hasn't been that way for a very long time. I mean, the last congressional race with Jane Dittmar, they were 18 points behind, and we're now neck and neck according to 538 and some of the best people in the business. That is because our campaign has spent so much time in rural counties. I've been at this for 16 months. My opponent has been at it just for the summer. And he seems to be spending so much time thinking about Russia. I don't know how much he's having the opportunity to think about the 5th District. But you have to put the time in to really see what the needs are in every county. And that's what we've been doing. So we don't have a credibility gap. People are seeing us, we're out there, and we are listening and figuring out how to best put the needs of the district to good use in Washington. No, we don't have that problem.
Okay, Mr. Riggleman, a rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, my wife told me I had the unique ability to multitask in my brain because I have an IQ above moron. Thank you.
All right, moving on to Elena Cantwell from PVCC. This question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
Mr. Riggleman, after the school shootings in Florida and Texas, many parents, students, and faculty are concerned for their safety. Will you support policies that advocate for safer school environments?
I will. I think, when you have children that go to school, I think that's one of the most fearful things is to have something like that happen. Here in Virginia, going down on the south side, looking at what the SROs are doing within the schools, I think that's very important. With the resource officers, I think what they're doing is a heck of a job. We do have issues with mental health. We have issues with targeted intelligence that we have to look at, especially on social media. When you're scrubbing social media and you're looking at things like that, I think that's why the resources that we give to law enforcement is very important right now. We're working with a bunch of graph analytic databases to look across all the social media to see if we can find out what's going on there. So, with the SROs, with increased law enforcement, we're looking at mental health, especially with actually identify them in schools early. I think that's something that we can do to help with that.
Okay. Moving on to Siobhan. This question will be for Ms. Cockburn.
Ms. Cockburn, there are parts of the southern portion of our district where transportation improvements could really help with economic development. Is there a way to allocate more funding for transportation projects across the 5th? If so, how will you do that?
Well, I hope to get on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to do just that. The first time I visited Brunswick County and met with the head of the Democratic Party, I said, "Where's the bus stop in Lawrenceville?" And he said, "It's in Richmond, an hour and a half away." I have a friend who's chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Prince Edward County, Patty Cooper Jones, and Patty has devoted she has pledged that the one thing she will accomplish is to get the bus to come to Prince Edward. In Bedford County, the one thing they really, really want is the train to stop in Bedford. All of these things can be addressed. You know, it transformed Culpeper. As soon as the train stopped in Culpeper, the city completely blossomed. And we can do that here. And yes, and I also have spent time with transportation companies like Jaunt. You know, you've seen the little Jaunt trucks around, buses around Charlottesville. Jaunt, if they get some extra funding, will go further. Right now they go to Buckingham or they go to Nelson. They will go further if they have funding. So to maximize what the bus companies can do that we have is something that we definitely can go forward with. But yeah, let's bring some buses and trains to the 5th.
Okay, we have time for just one more question, so we'll hand it over to Frank Friedman. This question will be for Mr. Riggleman.
Okay. You've addressed this to some degree, but I hope you'll be very specific. How would you address the federal budget deficit? And how would you address getting a balanced budget?
A balanced budget now? That's a great question. I think the first thing I would do, there was something that was done here by George Allen a long time ago. I think it was the Blue Ribbon Commissions. When we look at anything that, even with our Pentagon spending that we're doing right now, we sort of scrub off what the overhead prices and the overhead costing is. What I would like to do when I get in there is look at what we're doing as far as contract vehicles and how we're doing it. It's just something I've been in acquisitions for a long time, especially with material, but also with people. When you look at the budget, even with a budget like ours, I guess our office budget right now, it's anywhere, I can't tell the exact number, but it's between $3 and $10 million. So what you have to do is you have to look and scrub every piece of that budget, look what the overhead costs are, look at what they're doing as far as personnel, and then start saying this is too expensive, this is less expensive. We have got to do that across every agency, and that includes the DoD. When I read something, and I know it's true, when you read something there's $125 billion of slough missing in the DoD, that's a real number. That's not milk money. When you look at Medicare, Medicaid, and social services, and you look at 70% of the budget is actually sunk into that, you have to start looking at new ways of doing business. And I think a lot of it has to do with, and there's even times, I don't know if this is going to be popular, I think there's times where for us, when we did operational readiness inspections in the military, we did UCIs, unit compliance inspections, we actually spent a little money to actually get up to where we were actually saving money. And I think we need more oversight on fraud, waste, and abuse in these areas. I think we need to look at how contracts are administered, and I think we need to look at some of the bureaucratic slough that we have in the departments.
All right, thank you very much. And that is going to wrap it up for this portion of the debate.
More debate coverage this week, including the race in Iowa's 3rd Congressional District, where incumbent